Good morning. My name is Karen Keppel. I'm a member of Westminster Social Justice Team. The Social Justice Forums are built around a common theme, and this program year, the theme is Building Solidarity Together, walking alongside all God's people, striving for a more just world, acting courageously to transform social systems and relationships. This morning, we are pleased to have and welcome Julia Decker, the Policy Director at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, where she oversees policy and advocacy work. Formerly, Decker served as Policy Director for the Minnesota affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and has worked on cases at all levels of the immigration system, up to and including the U.S. Supreme Court. Julia will be sharing how immigration law works in our country, opportunities for action, and addressing questions on current topics. And we would just ask that we hold our questions, which Julia is happy to address maybe after she's done with her presentation. So a couple of logistical items before we begin. For those attending here, when we get to the questions section, I'll have the microphone and we'll bring it around to you. And please use it and hold it like this so the people who are on the online session are able to hear. And those who are attending on the live stream, please submit your comment or question in the chat, and we'll monitor that and raise your question or comment. And then I'm going to also remind you of our commitment. The Social Justice Team has adopted some respectful conversation concepts for us to all follow. And this week, we're just going to focus on the top one, equity of voices. We benefit from hearing a variety of voices, and let's leave room for other people's perspectives so that we're good listeners. So before we begin, let's start with a short prayer. Holy One, God of justice, breathe into us today a spirit of curiosity and humility. Help us engage with mindfulness, following the lead of voices from our community. Guide our speech and our self-awareness so we may honor the divine in all people. Amen. So now please welcome Julia Decker.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Greatly appreciate the invite to talk a little bit about immigration law and policy, which, as many of you probably know, is a very hot topic right now. You've probably heard lots of talk about it in the media, in the news, etc. So, quick roadmap. I'll introduce myself a little bit, introduce Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota a little bit, give you some nuts and bolts about the immigration system, which is really complicated. For those of you who have done work in this area, you've probably had experience with the different agencies, the different forms, etc. We'll talk about what's happening on the ground right now, current events, and we'll talk a little bit about ways to get involved, ways to keep sort of informed about what's going on. And then we'll have time for questions and answers, hopefully. So, briefly, as you heard, I am the Policy Director at Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. So I do work in the state legislature. I work with other groups that are doing national advocacy at the congressional level. Previously, I worked at the ACLU of Minnesota, did really broad work there on a bipartisan basis. Before that, I was also an immigration practicing attorney, so I did deportation defense. I represented victims of crimes. Some of the deferred action, the Dreamers, did applications for them. So a lot of different experience, including 2 years as a teaching fellow at the University of Minnesota Law School's immigration clinics. Immigrant Law Center itself, we are a nonprofit. We are a nonpartisan organization. We're a 501c3, so we don't endorse candidates. We don't endorse parties. We are predominantly a legal services organization. We provide free immigration legal services to low-income immigrants and refugees across Minnesota, and we most recently opened an office in North Dakota. So with that, let's dive into some of the immigration nuts and bolts. And for some of you, this may be a little bit familiar, particularly if you are an attorney who has maybe done some pro bono work, volunteer work, but we will, then for you, it will be a little bit of a review. So what is immigration law? Maybe the most obvious is that it's federal law. These are laws and statutes that are passed by Congress. The Immigration and Nationality Act is a huge portion of the federal statutes, the US Code. It is also executive actions. And so this is the president, the White House, the administration taking executive action to do any number of things. There is very broad authority for the executive, the president, the administration to act in the area of immigration. It's also agency decisions, and in a couple slides, we'll talk a little bit about who are the agencies, because there are executive agencies. They're not courts per se, but they are making decisions in immigration cases. And so these executive agencies can also make decisions that are precedential, that bind everybody in the immigration system. And then you have federal court rulings. So some immigration cases, if they get appealed high enough, will end up in federal court. And from there, they can end up at the Supreme Court even. And one of the cases that I worked on that went all the way to the Supreme Court, just to give you a little bit of a sense of, I guess, how it can go, was a case about whether a sock, like a sock that you wear on your foot, constitutes drug paraphernalia for purposes of deportation. That was the issue we went to the Supreme Court on. So we can talk. Hey, I could give you a whole seminar just on the sock case, but happy to talk more with folks about that after. Quickly, what immigration law is not. It's not criminal law. We hear a lot of immigration stuff being talked about in terms of crimes that were committed or the criminal statutes, and they do interact in a lot of different ways. However, immigration law itself, all the statutes that are about immigration, all the decisions, the agency decisions, they are not part of any criminal code. Likewise, if you hear somebody say, I'm going to immigration court, that is not criminal court. And in fact, it is not court in any way that generally attorneys may understand it, because these are not judicial courts. These are not courts that exist in the judiciary. They're courts that exist under the Department of Justice. So not just really kind of court, but kind of not. And immigration law is not state law. Again, lots of state laws can interact with immigration law in a lot of different ways, but the states themselves can't change the rules around who gets to come into the country, who gets a visa, those types of issues. The states don't have control over that. So what does immigration law cover? It covers all of these things. And so it's just an incredibly broad swath that applies to anybody who is not a citizen. This includes folks who have a green card, folks who might be a refugee, folks who are in the process of applying for an immigration status. All of those folks, if they're not a naturalized citizen or US-born citizen, they're subject to all the immigration laws. Lots of different things here. I won't have to read all of them to you. I will note that, for instance, just the visa issuance issue itself, there is an entire alphabet of visas, and they apply to really different things. There's visas for diplomats. There's visas for athletes. There's visas, there used to be, I'm not sure if there still is, there used to be a visa for sheep herders, just to give you a sense of how specific those visas can get. And then, of course, naturalization, but also detaining people and deporting people is also part of the immigration laws. So who are the players? As you heard me mention a little while ago, there are different agencies involved. DHS, which is the umbrella agency, the umbrella executive agency that controls most parts of the immigration system, is a post-9/11, 2001 creation. Before 9/11, this was, some of you may have had experience with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. That was the predecessor to DHS. which then has sub-agencies that all handle slightly different parts of immigration, whether it's enforcement and putting people into detention, or it's receiving applications for citizenship and approving them or denying them, so on and so forth. As I mentioned, the Department of Justice is also involved, and the Department of Justice is the umbrella for immigration courts, which have immigration judges, as well as the appellate body for those immigration courts. So if somebody is in an immigration proceeding where the government is saying, we think we can deport you, that case is going to happen in the immigration courts, which is this EOIR sub-agency of the Department of Justice. And if they appeal that case, say they lose, the immigrant, the non-citizen appeals, they're still within the Department of Justice. A case only gets to federal court once a non-citizen has gone through those 2 levels within the Department of Justice. And the kind of really crazy thing is that somebody whose case is being appealed to a federal circuit court very likely is going to be deported, even while that case is making its way up through the federal circuit court. So a little bit, talked about some of these nuts and bolts, I guess, sort of by the book stuff. I think a lot of times these days we hear very binary discussion around immigration and immigrants. We hear legal, illegal, lawful, unlawful, documented, undocumented. It sort of, in some ways makes sense, right? Because you need a shorthand when you're talking sort of in colloquial discussion about what are these different categories of people, what does that mean for them, for us. The reality, though, is that the idea of immigration status is very nuanced, and in many ways is more of a spectrum than an actual binary. So to give you a sense of this, this is, again, a very broad sort of picture of the very different ways a person can have quote-unquote immigration status, but they are very different from the other person to their left or right that has immigration status. So people may be undocumented, for instance, we hear undocumented, right? A person can be undocumented in that they entered the country without any permission, they crossed between 2 ports of entry, just never had any permission, they don't have any permission now to be in the United States. A person could have come into the United States lawfully with any one of those alphabet soup of visas, so they were lawful at the time that they came in, but when the visa expired, they didn't leave. Doesn't make their entry unlawful, it doesn't make their coming into the country unlawful, but they are now here physically without permission. Just one way that undocumented really has 2 different sort of ideas in it. You have a lot of folks with what we would consider temporary documentation. People with DACA, dreamers. These are the children who arrived under 18, they were brought by their parents, they don't have status. They are able to work, they're given work authorization, but they can't ever get a green card as a DACA person. They're just stuck in DACA. And DACA could go away because, as I mentioned earlier, it was an executive action. And so the executive could at any point say, we're no longer going to do this program. And all of those people that have DACA, a lot of them would suddenly become undocumented, essentially. Temporary protected status is similar. You may have heard they talk about TPS for different countries. Similarly, people in TPS have a status, they're allowed to stay in the United States, but the TPS could end at any moment, and they may not have any other allowance to be in the United States if that TPS is taken away. And then you have a lot of people who are filing an application for any number of types of statuses. Karen and I were talking before the presentation about non-citizens who were a victim of a crime in the United States. And those folks, if they cooperate with law enforcement, maybe they testify in the case, those folks eventually may be eligible for what's called a U visa. But there's only 10,000 U visas available each year. So if that person applies for the U visa, they're in this huge line of other people who have also applied for the U visa. And while they're waiting for that application, they're not really documented because they don't have a permanent status. What they have is an application filed that eventually might be approved, that eventually might let them stay with some sort of permanent status. Refugees and asylees, I think we hear those terms talked about a lot as well. I think the distinction here is that refugees come to the United States with a status. These are, when you talk about refugee camps, right, these are people who were displaced. They're living somewhere and they can't go back to their home country. And the UN High Commissioner of Refugees has said, yes, we think you cannot return to your home country because you are going to be persecuted. So you have this status, you can go to the United States as a refugee. Those folks come into the country with a status. A person who's asking for asylum is a person who has come to our border or is already here in the United States regardless of their immigration status, but is in the same position. Something's happened in their home country that they now feel they cannot go back because they'll be harmed, because they'll be persecuted. And so they're applying for the same, essentially the same status as a refugee, but they're already here. So when we talk about asylum seekers, I think a lot of people sort of talk about it as kind of a loophole or some way around the system, but the reality is the very immigration law that the United States has in its federal statute very explicitly says a person who is physically present in the United States regardless of how they entered, because it recognizes that people may have to do certain things in order to flee persecution or harm. One other note that I think is interesting about this, the naturalized citizen piece, which I think a lot of times we think, okay, if somebody's a naturalized citizen, they're good to go, right? There are cases in which the government has tried to denaturalize people, and there have certainly been cases in which US citizens have been mistakenly deported to countries for any number of mistakes, errors, etc. Take a quick drink here, apologize. So again, beyond binaries, this is just to give you a sampling of the many different forms, paperwork, that a non-citizen in trying to access the immigration system might have to contend with. And this is just a sampling of them. The USCIS has a whole index of the forms, and people have to navigate all of these forms. There is no right to counsel. I mean, you're allowed to have an attorney, but there's no public defender model. So often non-citizens are trying to figure out these forms, they're trying to figure out the process by themselves, and often in times, English is their second language. And so you can just imagine, you see all these forms, and they have all these really complicated instructions about what you have to do and how you have to fill it out. Recently, there were some rule changes where it was like, if you don't fill out, the middle initial box on your form with NA, if you don't have a middle name, then we're gonna reject your application. And it's like, that seems a little bit harsh for what is essentially a clerical requirement. So just to give you a sense, again, this is an incredibly complicated process. It's not, when you hear people talk about doing it the quote unquote right way, this is just a sort of slice of what that quote unquote right way looks like and how easily it can get off the rails. Oops. There we go. Again, beyond binaries, I think we often have this distinction that is either implicit or sometimes explicit, but this idea that there are quote unquote good immigrants and bad immigrants, and of course that is a narrative that, again, is very not binary. People are moving from undocumented to documented status. They may have had contact with the criminal legal system at some point, but they have served their time, they've paid their fines, they're moving on. I think that in thinking about how we talk about immigrants and immigration generally, it's very easy to fall into these binary distinctions and sort of assigning a good and bad moniker to people based on their immigration status. And I think we could, again, have a very philosophical discourse about that, but I think I just want to flag it for folks that sometimes even when we're trying to sort of uplift immigrant stories and say, yes, these folks are working hard, they're contributing to our economy, et cetera, kind of putting some folks on a pedestal while sort of looking at other immigrants, asylum seekers, for instance, as quote unquote not doing it the right way or circumventing the system is not really helpful. And I think elevating certain I think immigrants are a very diverse group. And I think the idea that there are some who are good and some who are bad can be a very difficult narrative to combat, even as we, with our best intentions, try to uplift and highlight and elevate how immigrants and non-citizens contribute to our country, our communities. And again, just to re-emphasize that point, these are just some of the things that, sort of characteristics that might be attributed to any one non-citizen, immigrant, refugee within our communities. And that does not, increase or lessen their individuality, their individual experience, their sort of right to access this incredibly complicated system. And we as the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, we see a lot of folks who are very low income, who are really boxed out of all of the systems that would allow them to improve their life circumstances, improve their life quality. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of a judgment from some folks of, well, why would you want to help folks who, aren't lawyers, who aren't like skilled immigrants, aren't skilled folks who are coming into our communities? And I think it's really important just to try and push back on that and understand that the access to the system is sort of that baseline equity for everybody who's affected by the immigration system. So on the ground, some statistics that are both for nationwide and for Minnesota, pretty self-explanatory. I do think it's notable that a very large majority in both nationwide and in Minnesota of immigrants have some type of status. Now, of course, this could be the status, as I mentioned before, that you've got a lot of folks who have some sort of temporary status, but they do have essentially permission to be here in the United States. That's a very large percentage of folks, both nationwide and in Minnesota. But looking beyond the numbers, and this is sort of a self-reflection moment, I guess, or just a moment to think about and contemplate things that maybe you didn't know about the immigration system. Right now, today, there are people who are in county jails of Minnesota detained by ICE on civil administrative detention. They're not criminally detained. They're not detained. They're not jailed because they have a criminal conviction. They're jailed in a county jail for civil immigration violations. They may be housed in the same unit and even in the same room as a person who has criminal charges or has been convicted of a crime, but they themselves are not under criminal charges. And they can be detained indefinitely. There is no limit on how long a person can be detained under immigration detention. One of the very first cases I represented was a person who had been detained for 2.5, 3 years at the point that I got the case, and it was another year-ish before we were able to finally win that case. People who have gone through all the right processes, right? They've done all the application forms, they've submitted all the necessary evidence, which sometimes, I don't know if people know this, can sometimes include like DNA evidence. You have to go in and get a DNA test done to prove that you have a family connection, a family relationship with somebody. You do all those things, it could be 20, 30 years before your case actually makes it through the end of the process. That is not a functional system by most stretch of the imagination. I alluded to this earlier in that everybody, even folks who have a green card, are subject to the immigration laws a person with a green card can be put into immigration court proceedings and ultimately deported for relatively minor offenses. And this is not to say, oh, criminal offenses don't matter, right? They do. But 2 shoplifting convictions in Minnesota, regardless of how small the amount of, the property that was stolen was given, that's enough to get somebody with a green card deported. 2 shoplifting convictions. And I mentioned this also certainly in general in the immigration system, but I think what is particularly galling is that in immigration court, when a person's entire life is on the line, we're talking about losing everything, they're losing their family, they're being, sent back to a country they may not have ever been to since they were 5 years old. There's no public defender model. There's no guarantee of an attorney in the immigration court system. So you have folks in there who maybe speak limited English, maybe don't speak English at all, confronting a judge who works for the Department of Justice and a prosecutor who works for the Department of Homeland Security. And this person is expected to argue the case on their own about whether they should be deported or not. It's really kind of almost impossible, I think, when you think about considering, if you were dropped in Argentina, told you have to go to a courthouse and defend yourself against a bunch of legal charges that are in a different language than your own. Like, can you even imagine just how impossible that is, really? The other thing, and I think some of you, if you've ever been to immigration court and observed a hearing, again, these are civil immigration hearings, civil administrative detention. None of this is criminal. But the people who are detained by ICE and brought into immigration court, they're dressed in full orange jumpsuits and they're handcuffed and shackled. Yeah, it is a incredibly dehumanizing and really discouraging facet of the immigration court system. And I will also say, now in my experience, this was not quite as harsh, but some immigration courts will reprimand an attorney if they shake their client's hand, if they have any sort of physical contact with their client while in immigration court. So some current events on the sort of national level when we think about immigration. And of course, this is all, we're less than a month out from a general election, right? There is a lot that could change, as I mentioned, because the executive has so much power over immigration. Some of you may have heard about this program, which was called Parole in Place or Keeping Families Together. This was aimed at undocumented folks in the United States who are married to a US citizen. It was not a wholly new program. It exists already in certain instances to allow a person who's not otherwise documented to stay in the United States and go through the legal process. Many folks who are undocumented have to actually leave the country, go back to their country of origin, do a bunch of paperwork and interviews, and then come back into the United States having done all the legal processes that have to be done. This would have allowed those folks to not have to go back to their home country. This was implemented in the last month and almost as quickly was the subject of a lawsuit, and so it is now stayed, pending further briefing, pending further decision, and likely will not be decided until after the election. They are still accepting applications, so there's a lot of folks who are continuing to file for this, but probably won't know for many months until there's a court decision or whatever, whether they will actually be able to benefit from this program. There was also a final border rule that may not have gotten as much press, but I think is equally important to understand, that was, again, an executive action by the administration that says if border crossings are at a certain number for a certain amount of time, anybody who crosses the border without permission can't apply for asylum. And this is, obviously, it's likely to be challenged in court if it hasn't already, but there is a very explicit provision of the United States immigration law that allows people who entered the country without permission to apply for asylum. And so I think the really baseline question there is whether this is actually allowable or whether they have to go back and tell Congress to change the law if they want it to happen this way. But again, having to use the court system to try and challenge the legality or illegality of different things that have been tried by the administration. Federal litigation, for those of you who are attorneys, understand even cases that are not specific to your subject area can maybe have really large impacts on other areas of law. There was recently a court case from the Supreme Court, a decision basically overturning decades-long precedent about how courts have to treat agency decisions. And if you'll recall, agency decisions are a major part of immigration law. And so the fact that courts are now allowed to basically look at agency decisions totally new. They don't have to defer to the expert sort of expertise of the immigration agencies or other agencies. What does that mean? Of course, we're going to find out over the years as new court cases come up, but those kinds of things will continue to happen anytime, obviously, an immigration case gets before the federal courts, but also non-immigration cases are going to continue to have, sort of collateral impacts on the immigration system. And then I think, as many of us probably are aware, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation swirling around in social media, as well as just the media in general. One of the, I think, examples of this that happened fairly recently, and I don't enjoy being on Twitter, but it is a very interesting source of information to watch how different information and different narratives sort of morph and develop and sort of spread. But there was recently a statistic that was circulating about some huge number of, quote unquote, illegal aliens crossing the border. And what ended up being the actual statistic was that Border Patrol, Border Protection, published statistics of how many border encounters they had had. Encounters could mean you're encountering one person 6 different times. Every single one of those is tallied as an encounter. But somebody took that from encounter to actual number of persons crossing the border and just ran with it. And it exploded beyond, it was all over the place. And even as lots of folks tried to push back on it, tried to, explain the underlying reality, genie was out of the bottle, essentially. There was no way of putting that one back. And then I think acknowledging that a lot of the rhetoric and narratives that have been spread recently, not just recently, of course, going back to previous administrations, but very racist and even xenophobic tropes about non-citizens, refugees, immigrants. I think one thing that sometimes we don't necessarily think very deeply about is how much race and immigrant issues or immigration status really interact. Because, we can talk a lot about policing, right? We talk about policing being disparate, being disproportionate, being discriminatory. And then we talk about immigrants as sort of being a separate group of people who have their own issues, but not really talked about in the sense of how they are also impacted by the discriminatory, disproportionate, and disparate policing of communities of color. So I think that is, and I think one of my next slides will also sort of touch on that, but tropes that talk about cleanliness or tropes that talk about all these folks coming in are criminals, the discussion around invasion or, flood of people coming across the border. I think these are all really playing in some very old, in some ways, racist and xenophobic tropes. Excuse me. So what have states done? What have localities done? As we have seen, obviously, immigration reform has not passed at the federal level, and a lot of the rhetoric is getting more stringent. Our discourse is maybe getting more polarized. At the state level, some of you may know that Minnesota recently passed a driver's licenses for all bill. There was also a healthcare for all bill that was passed by Minnesota. There has been increased legislation around allowing the use of an ITIN, which is an individual tax identification number that stands in for a social security number for non-citizens who can't get a social security number. It allows them to still pay their taxes, essentially. And there have been laws passed to allow folks with an ITIN to apply for a rental or apply for utilities. Of course, we have also seen state governments trying to act against immigrants, right? We have seen Texas moving in very different ways than Minnesota to try and address what they see as issues at the border. There have been other states, and I'm not recalling off the top of my head, but definitely some states which have tried to sort of make a state crime around immigration status, which again goes back to that issue of immigration law is not state law. That issue around criminalizing entry, re-entry, et cetera, that is not a state issue. At the local level, some of you may be familiar or have heard the term sanctuary. This is separation ordinances. This is really saying the federal government cannot come in and take over local resources to do immigration enforcement actions. One of the key things I think about this type of legislation or ordinance is that it's not saying it's not prohibiting the federal government from doing what they're going to do. The federal government is tasked with immigration enforcement. If they want to come to Minnesota and try and arrest people for immigration violations, we can't tell them not to. But what we can say is you guys have to do it yourselves. You can't come in and tell county sheriffs or city police departments to give up their resources to do your job for you. That's really the baseline of a separation ordinance or a sanctuary policy, which I think is important to understand because so often what we hear about sanctuary policies is sort of over-exaggerated, I would say. Doesn't prohibit the federal government from coming in and doing immigration enforcement. What it does do is separate them from state and local resources. I can talk a little bit more about the other pieces if people are interested, but I would say those are the sort of key pieces on state and local. And this is, as I mentioned, this is a very, I think, sometimes difficult, not always super comfortable reflection to have, but how does immigration and immigration law and policy and discussions about equity and inclusion and sort of our values around being a country of immigrants, how does that comport with all these different sort of discussions that we are also having right now across society? Certainly my background as having worked at the ACLU for some time, thinking a lot about how do constitutional liberties and constitutional rights interact with these different immigration laws. You know, what does that mean for the underlying principle of constitutional liberties and constitutional rights? If we have statutes that allow indefinite detention, if we have immigration courts where the Fourth Amendment essentially doesn't apply, you know, you can have as much fruit of the poisonous tree as you want, and the immigration court can still use that to deport somebody. I mentioned race and ethnicity. Some folks may be aware, as you have Central American folks coming to the United States in larger numbers, yes, we have our sort of ideas, constructs around race and ethnicity. Folks that came from Guatemala who identify as Maya have a completely other experience with race and ethnicity and being a marginalized population subjected to genocide for 30 years that doesn't necessarily map easily onto our own understanding of those sort of concepts, and really created, I think, a lot of issues for lawyers, certainly when this population first became a major sort of part of our community, because we were asking all the wrong questions. We weren't asking the questions that, to their mind, made them understand what we were trying to get at, which is, were you harmed because of your race or ethnicity? I think this can even go down to a very baseline level of sort of cultural competency, because, for instance, again, with people who were coming from Guatemala who were predominantly Mayan farmers, we would ask for your birthday. And what they would tell us is it was the harvest season, or it was the planting season. We as American lawyers were really trying to pin certain dates based on our calendar. And for folks who were coming from Guatemala and the highlands who, were farmers, their entire concept of time was, well, it was the time when we were harvesting this particular crop. And so again, those kinds of things are constantly happening within obviously the lawyer-client conversations, but I think more broadly understanding just how different the entire context of the world can be based on where somebody is coming from. Oop. Well, I will note surveillance technology because this was also a major piece of work for me when I was at the ACLU. Folks may not realize how much surveillance technology is already operating at our borders, is already operating sort of in our private, by private entities. And I think sometimes we think of it as, well, it's a security measure, right? Like if we need to protect the borders and we use the surveillance technology, whatever. I think this again goes back to this question though about if the US government is using all these types of tools on this population or for these particular purposes, what does that mean for us as citizens that the government feels it can do or will do with these various new types of technology and the ability to surveil people in new and different ways? So I think people want, hopefully, to be continue to be informed and learn more. I did circulate these slides, and so hopefully people will be able to get access to those. Some very neutral, fact-based statistical resources, as well as some that are very Minnesota-specific, and then a little bit about ILCM, our history, and also our case eligibility, in case you have talked to somebody who potentially has an immigration legal issue. And then, again, this will be on, hopefully, circulated, but ways to get in contact with us. We do have a dedicated intake line, so if somebody has an issue and they're not sure if it's going to fall in within our case guidelines, we have intake. It's English and Spanish. And then we're on social media, even though I just talked about how kind of chaotic social media can be. We do use social media to get information out about what's going on, new developments, state legislative stuff, et cetera. So with that, I believe we are. You have another slide. You have a slide, but do you want to do Q&A now?
Yeah, we'll do some
Okay.
questions, but I'm trying to find the other microphone. Where? Oh, okay.
Could you tell us about immigration resources in the state of Minnesota? How many immigration courts and judges are there, and how are they doing? And then nonprofits such as the one you're associated with, and there are others that can help out. And then private lawyers who are specializing in immigration law, how do you find them?
All very good questions. So to talk about the immigration court here, it's in Fort Snelling. The judges, I think there's 3 or 4 right now, because I believe one is just being transferred out. It's usually in that realm of 3 to 4, maybe 5. I don't know the statistics offhand, but there is a really, really great website, and I'm not sure I linked it on here, but I should have. Syracuse University keeps an ongoing sort of website that just tracks all different types of statistics from immigration courts across the United States, including Minnesota. And so they have like a sort of running tally of, for instance, how many cases are pending at the immigration court in Bloomington. They call it Bloomington, it's in Fort Snelling. You know, how many removal orders have been issued, how long have people been detained, et cetera. I will send that to Karen so that that can be circulated, because it's a really interesting sort of wealth of data that my understanding is that they get from like having to ask, you know, use the Freedom of Information Act to get that information from the government. It's not necessarily information that gets put out easily. So I would say I will circulate that because it's a really good information resource. Legal nonprofits, so we are one, obviously, Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, or SMERLS. They do certain types of immigration cases, but they don't do cases, generally they don't do cases for undocumented folks because of their funding limitations. Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid also handles different types of immigration cases, including for undocumented folks. And then Advocates for Human Rights primarily handles humanitarian, so asylum, refugee type cases. There are, so International Institute of Minnesota, they aren't a legal office, but they offer a lot of like new arrival resources. So how do you get an apartment? How do you apply for your driver's license? Very on the ground, pragmatic, you know, information resources. Did I miss anything from that? I don't think so.
I have a question from the chat.
Yes.
She asks, what is being done to change the rules that would speed up jail time? Is anything happening? So I think that's in reference to when you're talking about they can be detained indefinitely.
There are lots of, there have been lots of court cases where folks have tried to get out of detention via federal court, rule, but it's really at base a federal statute. There's a particular piece of the Immigration Nationality Act that doesn't really specify, it's not really super clear about how long detention can last, and that has generally been interpreted in the immigration context to not have a limit. And so unfortunately, if we really wanted to change that, it would require congressional action, federal change, which is not a happy answer, unfortunately, I don't think, but.
So we have we have a lot of immigrants working in the agricultural sector, a huge number, and I read that in Wisconsin, maybe 10,000 or so working in the dairy industry alone, and that most of them are undocumented, but I assume they're getting paid and their employer has to withhold taxes because they're paying taxes. So they are at least sort of in the system, right? Because the government does know they exist. Under current law, if they chose to, could ICE come in and deport those people, and would they have any legal grounding for staying?
It's a very large, complicated answer. I mean, it's a very, yes, good question. So generally speaking, in terms of whether they'd be safe from deportation if ICE decided to conduct like massive raids, really depends on the individual situation, but a lot of them would probably not have any recourse. Folks who potentially were exploited, maybe they were the victim of wage theft or labor trafficking, some type of that exploitation, possibly might have an avenue towards, I'd mentioned the U visa, there's also a T visa that's specific to victims of labor trafficking. One of the broader issues around both immigration, federal immigration stuff, as well as state immigration sort of adjacent laws or policies is people are afraid to provide their information in a lot of instances, and understandably, because, as you mentioned, if you get that individual tax identification number, on the one hand, you're doing everything you can, right, to comply with the system. On the other hand, yeah, you've given your name, your address to one agency of the federal government, and there's really not a lot of guarantee that at some point ICE will, access that and use it. And I think similarly that, I mentioned about the temporary statuses. You've got DACA, you've got temporary protected status. Those folks, and I think it's maybe we have been in DACA so long that the threat doesn't feel as heavy, but those are also the type of places where folks might second guess actually applying for those temporary statuses, because as I mentioned, they can end at any time. And if you've submitted all your application information, a lot of, all that information, the government now has that information about you. And even if maybe you as a DACA holder have some other way of, fighting your deportation if ICE were to come to your door, what about all the family members in your house? A lot of folks are in mixed status families, so even if they have some type of status or some type of, permission, maybe your mom or dad doesn't. Maybe your older brother, your older sister doesn't. Maybe aunt and uncle. So the risk of, even if it's not a person specifically, the risk that ICE comes to your house because your address is on file, and therefore it puts all the family at risk, is also a very real concern for folks. So I wish there was like a very good answer to that. Unfortunately, I think it's a really, it's tough for a lot of people.
I have an example. It's an answer to your question. I was found a number of years ago to have 5 undocumented people at my company. And we were very cooperative with the government, and our employees were very cooperative. But they made it pretty clear they would have to move on to other employment. They were not under any threat of deportation. Now, obviously, if they had misdemeanors or warrants or something, it would be a different world. But I think there's just too many. So to your dairy worker question, they'd tell them to move to another dairy if they caught them. And, there is that issue of you can have this fake Social Security number that the government issues to you, and surprise, they'll allow you to pay your taxes, but you can't ever get them back again.
Right, yeah. And I think as we think about post-November, regardless of what the administration is, even if, say, there was like a immigration raid in like one city in Minnesota, and it was a relatively small number of folks who were impacted, I think the broader impact of sort of fear that impacts the community more broadly, might sometimes be the goal of a particular raid, and also it just has a ripple effect that doesn't require a huge number of folks to have actually been picked up or affected in order for it to be extremely anxiety-inducing, I think, for a lot of communities.
I think that is a wrap. I want to thank Julia Decker. If we could all thank Julia for a fascinating presentation and conversation. Thank you so very much. I just want to call attention to next week. Next Sunday, we have a panel of Westminster youth and Associate Pastor Alexandra Jacobs sharing experiences and lessons from this past summer's youth service learning work. So hopefully we'll all see or hear from you then. Thanks so much.